Refreshing wild cherry cola meets smooth cream. The treat you deserve. Pepsi Wild Cherry and Cream. Treat yourself.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. Stop waiting around for the perfect candidate. Instead, use Indeed sponsored jobs to find the right people with the right skills fast. It's a simple way to make sure your listing is the first candidates see. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs have 4 times more applicants than non-sponsored jobs. So go build your dream team today with Indeed. Get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
Hello everybody, it's Tyler with 3D Printing Basics. If you guys were interested in getting every single episode of this podcast, 3D Printing Basics, ad-free and a week early, and also getting exclusive perks such as exclusive episodes that only you can listen to and more, then subscribe on Patreon. My link will be down below. I would really appreciate it if you guys would consider supporting me. All the support I've already received has meant the world to me, so thank you guys so much. If not, no worries. Continue to consume these episodes for free, and I appreciate you listening regardless. So thank you guys very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Hello, and welcome back to 3D Printing Basics. This is episode number 101, and in this week's episode, we are going to be going over the hidden costs of cheap filament. I know whenever we get started in 3D printing, we tend to try and keep costs as low as possible. We want to fit within our budget. You know, we're trying out a new hobby. We don't want to sink a bunch of money into it right away. And that often leads us to buying the cheaper filaments compared to something that would be more middle of the line or even more on the higher side of things when it comes to cost. But there are the hidden costs of it. And the truth of these cheap filaments is that they often come with problems that end up costing you more time and costing you more money than if you just went with the middle of the line or higher end filament to start with. So we're going to be going over that today. Please don't forget to like and follow this podcast. It definitely really means the world to me, and leave a 5-star review if you have the chance. It would definitely mean a lot to me if you did. If not, no worries. Let's go ahead and jump right into today's episode. So yeah, cheap filament. I definitely have had this problem come around once or twice, especially when I was just started getting with a business or just started turning this into a business, and cost really mattered. I was trying to watch every dime, every penny, trying to make sure that everything was going to be where I wanted it to be so that I could run a successful business. And so I started buying the cheap filament. There was this filament from China that I was buying. It was $11 per kilogram, which for those of you that don't know, it was PLA, which is still, even though it's PLA, it's a pretty good cost, a really good cost per kilogram in terms of that filament. And I was doing a large job with it. I was doing about 1,500 pieces. And what I was discovering throughout the printing process of these 1,500 pieces is I was having tons of problems, and I couldn't understand what was going on because in all the test runs that I had done, every part turned out great. I didn't change anything with the setup. I didn't change any of the support interface, anything like that, the slicing, anything. Everything was going so good in testing, and I couldn't figure out what was going on. And then it came to me that it might be the filament, because the filament was really cheap, which means it might not be such a high quality. And so I really took a look at these filament rolls, and what I found was really not good. I found inconsistent diameters. In some spots it was measuring, I was 1.75 millimeter filament. In some spots it was measuring as low as 1.6, other spots as high as 1.9 millimeters, which is going to cause a lot of problems when it comes to over and under extrusion for your printer. I found there was actually some, I don't know how to describe it, but it was just artifacts, foreign objects inside the filament itself that were causing clogging issues and just not letting the filament extrude at all. And there were tangles in the spool. Almost every single spool was wet because it was packaged properly. And overall, it ended up costing me more money than if I just got some, normal filament that was $20 or even $30 per kilogram. Because the time that I spent trying to work with that and the extra filament that I had to buy because I kept getting so many print failures, just at the end of the day, it cost me so much more money. And even if you're not running a business, even if you're just, using this as a 3D printer in your home, you're just messing around with it, it's going to cost you, it could potentially cost you more money down the line. I don't want to say it's going to, because it's definitely not a certainty. There are some good cheap filament brands out there. But I would say more often than not, you are putting yourself at risk for spending more time, spending more money trying to work it out with the cheap filament than if you just went with the normal name brand filament that you could find pretty much anywhere. So we're going to dive a little bit deeper onto each of those topics that I mentioned, and we're just going to kind of talk about it overall. But yeah, I just wanted to start off with a personal experience of mine, and a very hard lesson that I learned very early on in my business is that you don't always want to go cheap. There are definitely some times when it helps out if you find a good brand that you can rely on, that they make pretty good quality filament. Obviously, you're not going to be expecting top-notch stuff when you're spending less than, I don't know, $15 a kilogram or somewhere around there. But something that is reliable and you know works good enough for the application you need it for, then it can definitely work. But there are definitely some issues if you run into those. And one of the biggest issues that you're going to come around with in this kind of space of the cheaper filament is what I mentioned, the inconsistent filament diameter. This was probably one of, if not the biggest problem for me when I was using this cheap filament, was just the crazy differences in the filament diameter. I mean, we know 1.75 millimeters is not a large size, and yet I could see the inconsistencies in filament. A couple millimeters here, it would look gigantic. It would look, really big. And then you move a couple millimeters down, maybe 20, 30 millimeters down, and it would look tiny. It would look really under extruded. And that was a big problem for my printers because it was either getting force fed too much filament because of the bigger diameter of the filament, and we were having problems with over extruding, or it wasn't getting fed enough filament, and that led to under extrusion, which overall led to really sloppy prints with really low quality. So, you can see filaments that have, 1.6 millimeters on the low end, 1.8 millimeters on the high end. You really want to find something that is just consistently in that 1.75 millimeters area. Usually a plus or minus 0.02 or 0.03 millimeter is fine, especially when it comes to flow rate. But overall, you just want to make sure that you have something that is consistent as possible on the diameter side, because if not, you're going to have over extrusion and under extrusion on the same print usually, because usually if it's going to be over, it's going to be under in some spots. It's just, how the filament manufacturing process goes. But yeah, you just want to make sure that you can get it as consistent as possible so that you don't have to deal with these unnecessary extrusion issues. Another issue with these cheaper filaments, it's not with every single brand, but usually with the cheaper filaments, they aren't storing them in, humidity controlled places, temperature controlled places where filament should be stored so that when it gets to your door, it's nice and dry and ready to use. That was definitely one of the problems that I had, was some of these were really, really wet, like they had absorbed a ton of moisture, and most of it was honestly manageable, but what wasn't manageable was the inconsistency. I would have one roll printing, it would be in the middle of a job, it would completely finish out that roll, and say that roll was at, 40% humidity, which isn't ideal, but it's reasonable. You can make it work. And then I'd put in another roll, which was at 60, 70%, water absorption, so that it was steaming out the nozzle. And that just completely ruined that print because of the inconsistencies that you have there. And that's going to be one of the biggest factors when it comes to the hidden costs of these cheap filaments. It's just a consistency problem. And, when you're trying to make filament and sell it for that cheap, chances are you're going to cut corners on quality. And, when quality is affected, then consistency is affected. And we as 3D printers rely on consistency in our filament, because usually these prints that we're running, they take a lot of filament. We aren't running a lot of super tiny jobs. We're offering almost every single print job we're running is going to be at least 100 grams of filament, and multi-hour prints, 5-6 hours at least. So at the end of the day, we need consistency, or else these prints just are not going to turn out, and they're not going to be as high quality as we need them to be. And if you're running a business, or if you're just a hobbyist at home, you're going to have problems. And so that's definitely a big factor. But yeah, you want to make sure, especially with the filaments that absorb a lot of moisture, like the PETG, the nylons, the TPUs, if you're getting a cheap filament, you really want to check them yourself if you can, or maybe just preemptively dry them. You can turn your printer into a filament dryer if you need to. I made my own out of a bucket and a food dehydrator. You can just stick them in the oven if you want to. There's a lot of different options for drying your filament, but you just want to make sure they are all consistent and at least around, maybe within 5-10%, the same humidity or water absorption kind of area. You just don't want to be sticking in a roll that has, way low on the water absorption scale, and then sticking in another one that is really high, and then having those two combined for one print, because you're going to run into a lot of problems there. And then where kind of all this bubbles up and kind of gets around to is the wasted prints. And that's really where the cost comes from, because especially, if you're running a business, if you're a hobbyist and you just like to see good quality prints, the consistency, like I said, is going to be a problem. And so you're going to get some prints coming off the bed that look good, they look fine, they're totally usable, no worries there. And then you're going to get some prints that are just absolutely unusable. And you're going to get some prints that fail because of the under extrusion, the over extrusion problems. Some parts are just going to completely fail. The layers are not going to adhere together, and they're either going to split or they're going to come off the bed, or they're just not going to work. You can have a clog, like I mentioned, with the foreign objects that I found in my filament. And overall, you're just going to have a lot higher fail rate than what you normally would if you had a consistent filament to work with. So that is time and money going down the drain, or rather into the trash can, every time you're throwing prints away that just are not working out. And so say you had 10 parts that you were making with a $20 per kilogram roll, and you make the 10 parts and maybe, I don't know, 2 fail, right? So at $10 a part, that's $120 in material that you spent. Now say you're making those same 10 parts, but you're using the cheap filament and you have a way higher failure rate, let's say 50%, and 10 of those fail, right? If you're running it at even, above the $10 filament, or $10, excuse me, then, that's 20 rolls right there that you're going through, and that's, the $10. It may not be as high the first time, but if you have anything higher than the $10 per kilogram threshold, say it's $12, $13, or you have a higher failure rate, it's going to cost more than if you just went with the medium line or the top of the line filament. And so that's definitely something to consider if you're going with cheap filament, especially if you're having a higher production run where you're running a lot of parts. If you're just using it for like a one-off part, a drafting, something, you can often tweak settings to be able to work with the filament and get something that ends up printing okay. But if you're running thousands of parts, like in my specific situation, then you're going to have issues with the consistency, which I know I keep touching on it, but consistency is the main thing with 3D printing filament. We need it to be consistent, or else we're going to have problems. And the biggest part with cheap filament is just the lack of consistency, and that can lead to the wasted prints, which then, it turns into evening out the cost. But again, with that cost, the cost still might be less if you're using the cheap filament. You might end up spending less if you have a lower failure rate than 50% or something like that. But the frustration, I'm telling you, the frustration, there is no price on how frustrated you get when prints keep failing and you keep having to toss prints in the trash. It doesn't matter how cheap the filament is. If you're going to try and get away with it, that frustration will definitely get to you. I know it got to me when I was first running that job. So that's definitely something to consider, is kind of, are you willing to make that sacrifice of say, hey, maybe I'll have a higher failure rate, but at the end of the day, I want to use this cheap filament. And that's totally fine if you do. If you're fine with a higher failure rate and the cost maybe equaling that of a medium line or top of line filament, that's totally fine. I say go for it. Save that money if you can. And, I'm not saying if you get a cheap filament, it's a guarantee that you're going to have a 50% failure rate and everything's going to mess up. You might get a good line. I actually found a good line myself probably about 6 months ago. It's a little bit more expensive, about $13 per kilogram. But at the end of the day, this one is much more consistent, and I'm able to tweak the settings, get it uniform, and get parts printing that are of good quality and are able to be sent off to the customer, and I have no issues with it. So that's definitely something to consider. I'm not trying to tell you avoid cheap filament at all costs, because it's going to fail and you're going to be banging your head against the wall. Just if you get cheap filament, just check out a couple lines, try them out. Figure out what you like, what you don't like, what you're looking for in the cheap filament, and what you can afford to maybe not have when it comes to the quality assurance. And just find that kind of happy medium that you're looking for. And cheap filament can be a really good resource for you to use, because at the end of the day, you would be saving tons of money if you are able to get the fail rate, around normal, what normal printers are. If you manage to tweak the settings, tweak the filament settings, and you could get really, really good parts churning out, and then we got no problems there. But I just wanted to simply warn you guys about the dangers of the cheap 3D printing filament line, and kind of how, even though you think you're saving money, it could at the end of the day cost you a little bit. So another thing, kind of the last two things, I'm going to kind of bundle them together because number 5 is kind of goes hand in hand with everything. But spool tangling, this isn't nearly as much of a problem as what I feel like I've heard people talk about. I've never once had, or actually, sorry, one time in my years of 3D printing, my 6+ years of 3D printing, I've received a filament spool that was tangled. And it was actually from a higher a higher top of the line filament. So, I'm not saying it doesn't exist out there, but especially with these cheaper filament lines, the quality control just isn't going to be as good. So you just want to make sure you're looking out. Maybe your spool is tangled, maybe it's not, but just definitely something to kind of mention and to kind of think about. And, number 5, it just goes hand in hand with everything. It's just the poor quality control. Most of the time, these filament brands are coming from China. And I'm not saying anything bad about China and their manufacturing. A lot of their manufacturers are really good. But at the end of the day, the quality control is not going to be as good as these higher line, Hatchbox filament is something that comes right to my head as a higher top of the line sort of filament. They have really good quality control. They emphasize that they have their plus minus 0.02 millimeter diameter consistency checks. And, just at the end of the day, if you're getting a cheaper filament brand, that is not going to be something that you're going to be afforded. And so, like I said, it just kind of comes down to what you're willing to sacrifice and what you're willing to accept in order to save money on your 3D prints. But with that being said, that's all I have for you guys today. I hope you guys were able to learn something about kind of the hidden costs of 3D printing. And